Okay, thank you for your invitation. Um, in 1941, when Claude Lévi-Strauss came in New York City, in order to escape from the Vichy government, he gave an amazing description of the city. He didn't underline the modernity, but the accumulation of old and exotic curiosities, something like a huge Noah's Ark where people could find objects from all around the world. This description suits two metropolises in the 19th century. This contribution would like to understand the circulation of non-European artifacts, old and new, through the construction of this marketplace and understand how the market exoticizes goods. In other words, I would like to observe times and spaces where objects became exotic, the time between creation and bourgeois consumption, and the processes of exoticization or commodification. Thanks to commercial and private archives, I would like to observe the construction of a new market, larger and in the same time specialized, in Paris and New York City and sometimes in London, but also in the touristic spaces. The import and consumption of exotic goods were not a novelty of the 19th century, as you know. The novelty was the desire for authentic exotic goods, uncreated or unsullied by European commerce and imagination, at the time of the democratization of this consumption. In this way, maybe non-European was not really a category. Indeed, non-Western urban goods was the framework of bourgeois consumption, included goods from prehistoric age and from peasants and savages. So, in order to understand how urban societies became Noah's Arks, we have to cross, obviously, borders between different spaces and times, between everyday life objects and merchandise, but also borders between authentic and forgeries, and border between consumption sphere and scientific sphere. The emergence of this marketplace for bourgeoisie went through a kind of specialization. In Paris and London, from the middle of the 18th century onwards, rare shops that sold curios mixed them with paintings, novelties, and natural history things. For example, still in 1848, Edmond de Goncourt found by chance a savage arrows and an Indian smoked head in a small stall close to the Louvre. No dealers were specialized yet, but some antiques goods dealers offered large collections. The notary who made the inventory of the Parisian dealer Hakoun in 1854 was in trouble faced with these things. How name them and how give a price for Negro baskets, savage guitar from Brazil, and other wild stuff. Around 1850, we can observe a sort of formalization of the market. Natural history dealers excluded human artifacts, except prehistoric items. After 60s, curious dealers tried to appear with a specialization. Eugène Boban, an important dealer, announced specialties, but many, as you can see, pre-Columbian, but also Neo-Caledonian, African, Indian, prehistoric, French antiques, etc. Eman in 1870s was an important, maybe the first dealer in African objects, but he sold also antiques goods and goods from peasants. In New York, one can't find specialized shops, and many ethnographic goods were displayed in natural history shops, while nature prevailed over history of humanity. From 80 onwards, one can find some specialization, but only in Chinese or Japanese, and Chinese named often Indian and Japan goods. But the number of curious dealer shops blew up. In 60s, we can find around 200 shops in Paris and London, and around 100 in New York City. A new geography emerged. Many shops settled in the Vieux Paris, Spaces escaped from Haussmannian works and out of commercial spaces in bourgeois imagination. In New York City, they were in south of Union Square. These shops appeared as utopian or anachronistic spaces. They were dressed up with old facades, colonial architecture in New York City, and from the cloudy Middle Age in Paris. And dealers gave suggestive names: Au Vieux Paris, Souvenir d'Orient. Some dealers in ethnographic and prehistoric goods, as Boban, imitated natural history shops with large shops window. So exotic goods were sold between scientific decor and decor from the past. In this way, they appeared as objects out of the economic world. In this decor, the display was essential because it had to preserve the power of evocation and the nature of exotic goods, unique and free from industrial and modern tracks. These things had to be discovered as finds, the opposite of merchandise. So a double display was created. On the one hand, customers could buy items classified in display cabinets. On the other hand, dealers created a picturesque and Romanesque bric-a-brac underlined by all newspapers. Walter Dyer, for example, was enthusiastic about, I quote, a fascinating shop in 4th Avenue with its dusty disorder and a strange dealer. The Boban's shop in elegant Boulevard Saint-Germain was a bric-a-brac too, but every artifact had a label with number and a caption. Dealers created an atmosphere. Even in elegant places in Upper East Side or in Seine River banks, dealers maintained darkness, but archives show us beside in back shop they had gas and electricity, and then electricity. Last point, goods seem just unpacked the very morning. The Boban's shop. So in every shops, customers discovered boxes of shipping company with labels from customs and straw spread out on the ground. Ventin announced in 1885, just received ex-Timur Bengal Oriental rugs, carpets, and ancient embroideries direct from original sources. Advertisements showed people packing goods and goods on boats or camels. Goods had to appear unsullied by trade. Playing with this imagination, several dealers took appointments with customers in hotels. At last, the dealer had to appear as a stranger in connection with exotic areas. For example, in New York City, a guide wrote about Mr. Mandil. He keeps on hand a complete assortment of Japanese, Chinese, and Turkish art treasure, which are imported direct. Mr. Mandil is a native of Constantinople, Turkey, and has resided in this country for the last 6 years. In the days of catalogs, incarnation of industrial series, exotic unique goods required other way of advertising. Curious dealers sent boxes with objects, and amateur could choose something, send money to the dealer, and send the box to another collector. Thanks to this system, customers through Europe and America could see and touch this object, but also they had a feeling that they were included in a community of amateurs, not customers. And last but not least, boxes evoked transport and travel. Another way of advertising grew up. The publication of little catalogs, which imitated auction catalogs, and after 80s, small catalogs with drawings, thanks to stenciling, but only for indistinct things, prehistoric stones or American Indian weapons. But because they are unique, these goods were advertised with photo carte de visite and sometimes large photographs. that allowed to send numerous copies by post through international networks, and they allowed to preserve the uniqueness of these goods, or this kind of photograph. Beside the marketplace, the trade of exotic curiosity went through apparently non-commercial urban stages. The first one were studios, especially of painters and photographs. For 1830 onwards, romantic and academic painters gathered in their studios many objects essential to make an archaeological and exotic painting. Sometimes travels were only in imagination. For example, De la Mare, during the 1850s, was the ethnographic painter of Chinese everyday life, but he had never been in China. He took things and information from the Société Asiatique de Paris. But unsurprisingly, the first exhibition of American Indian relics in Paris, for example, was organized by a painter, Catlin, who sold many Indian curiosities and manufactures. In Paris, as well as in New York City and London, dealers developed new associations or partnerships with painters. Painters took exotic goods in dealers' shops, and in return, their paintings advertised goods. Bourbon, for example, furnished Jean-Paul Laurens in Mexican items, and he displayed objects and paintings or production of paintings in its shop window. Le Bon Marché, too, formed an association with Jérôme. In its paintings, reproduced in catalogs, customers could see oriental carpets sold in the department store. That's the same phenomenon with photographers who gathered things from all around the world. Saroni at Union Square had 300 Toltec and Aztec antiquities, weapons from Zulus and Egyptian mummies. Without surprise, in these studios, bourgeois could buy exotic goods seen in painting or photographs. Painters appeared as people who could convert everyday life things into a decorative piece with a new artistic aura. So, several painters like the Orientalist Descamps organized sales in auction rooms in Paris, London and New York City, and they had a great success. At the end of the century, numerous painters became dealers at the other side of the mirror. Through paintings and studios, objects became valuable, and this artialisation, I don't know in English, became also a way of advertising. Besides shops, many temporary private exhibitions, named commercial exhibitions, that imitated museum had a great success, like Catlin with the Indian Museum, or the Musée Chinois in Paris, or the Japan Museum in New York City that sold pieces. But they are also close to customs. Delessert exhibited his collection in custom in Le Havre, the collection of weapons from Pacific Highlands. Visitors had to get an entrance ticket, and then they could buy goods. World Fair had also a great role. Often we forget it. Visitors could buy objects in national section. For example, people bought, I quote, curiosities from savages in Canadian section, or in spaces dedicated to history of work. And as you know, Nela Diaz, the exhibition of 1878 will be the base of the first museum of ethnography in France. But we have to remember that a large part of artifacts came from dealers. Another urban stage is promoted and sold exotic goods, the theater, the favorite form of entertainment in metropolises. After 1850, several plays had ethnographic and colonial patterns furnished by dealers. For example, in Paris, the Théâtre du Châtelet presented in 1879 La Vénus Noire, Voyage dans l'Afrique centrale. Before and after the show, public could see in the foyer the African Museum, le musée africain, with hundreds African objects. Theater distributed program catalog, and after the last show, artifacts were sold by auction. In New York City, the Fifth Avenue Theater from the 80s onwards sold exotic goods. For the opera booth, the Mikado, the director, I quote, displayed in the foyer a large bric-a-brac of lovely exotic bibelots. These items gave an authenticity to the place and conversely, scenes gave a new Romanesque dimension to the goods. The exotic and wild things require a peculiar way of commercialization, mixing art, shows, and pseudo-scientific exhibitions that hide the process of commodification because these places appeared as cultural institutions. A place mixed all these aspects, the auction rooms. The democratization of authentic exotic goods conception started at the same time, the democratization of authentic exotic good conception and the democratization of auction started at the same time. Christie's was maybe the first place during the 40s and 50s, but for elite. And it organized auction dedicated to exotic goods, above all Chinese and Japanese goods. In Paris, Drouot Hotel was the new auction room built in 1852, and from its opening onwards, it had a great success in bourgeoisie. Larousse wrote about Drouot, every day, from all the parts of the world, from all nations, products of art and industry went under the auctioneer's hammer. Objects came from painters, travelers, explorers, collectors, but also from dealers. In New York City, we can find, In New York City, we can find the same phenomenon. From the end of 40s onwards, Knickerbocker, Kirby, Levitt, and others settled along Broadway, sold exotic curios for bourgeoisie. Some houses were specialized, like Richard Walter's Sons. His huge modern room was filled with, I quote, exotic bric-a-brac for a first-class clientele. At that time, only all goods from Japan and China were separated, but auctioneers organized auction session with goods gathered by kind of object and provenances. After 1860, one can find specialized auction for all Japan lacquers, and after 1880, for wild things from Pacific Islands, for example. Bourgeois found in this place authentic goods guaranteed by experts and with singular stories, former owners, provenances, etc., told in catalogs and by the auctioneers. This visit became a bourgeois ritual. Exhibitions and catalogs appeared as encyclopedia of curiosities. With catalogs, posters, and columns in newspaper, auction sales constructed a new space, public but distinctive, for curiosities. In auction rooms, bourgeois learned prices and cultural values of these goods, and with a bidding system, Charlotte, they shaped a collective price for goods without price. I think that if we want to understand the sense and the value of these goods, which were created by their travels, it's necessary to understand how curious dealers in metropolises found and fed their trade. Besides the painter's commerce, many exotic goods in Europe came from state employees and captains, and without surprise, when they traveled, they brought back many goods. From the 1830s onwards, French and British government installed people in Africa, Asia, and Pacific Islands, and many companies installed engineers. Most of them started a collection of curious and natural things. When they came back, they sold their collection, or with their death, these things fed the marketplace. The Second Empire started many military campaigns in Cochinchine, China, North and West Africa, and in Mexico. In this way, many soldiers started the traffic of curios and antiques. Sometimes it was a pillage, sometimes a commerce with local shopkeepers, or finds from wild excavations. Except Egypt, countries didn't have a legislation at that time. So soldiers and civil engineers became correspondents for dealers. Eugène Boban received around 300 letters and 200 boxes from them and from all around the world. A soldier sent in Mexico in 1862, after a year in China, wrote to Boban, "I'm fed up with my Chinese antique goods collection. Do you want to buy it?" I started a new collection of pre-Columbian goods. And when he died, his widow sold his collection to Boban, who received the same kind of mails from New Caledonia, China, Algeria, and from dozens of soldiers. We can't, oh, sorry, it's okay. We can't distinguish history of colonization and campaigns from the history of exotic curios traffic. Unsurprisingly, the first antiques and curios dealer specialized in curios from Africa. In Paris, Maurice was a former professional soldier. If several things from Mexico and South America came to New York City, networks were different because few American people were settled in exotic place, except Japan. As you understood, between 1860 and 1819, Boban built a huge network, thanks to maritime companies and railway. He imported objects from Mexico. He stayed during the Mexico campaign, in particular mummies and pre-Columbian objects. He imported objects from Pacific Islands, a kind of prehistoric species out of history in bourgeois imagination. Objects from Africa and from rural societies of northern Africa, didn't marked by the Ottoman Empire and French colonization, but he imported also objects from North America. Boban stayed 3 times in New York City during 1870s. He got in touch with curiosities dealers in New York City, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Chicago. And after 80s, France was passionate by American Indian native. Boban started a new trade. He sent to antiques dealers in United States boxes filled with Celtic relics and trinkets from the French 17th and 18th century, pipes, fans, etc. In exchange, he received many boxes from United States with peace pipes, ancient tomahawks, war clubs, and many boxes of antiquities, Indian antiquities, and with Indian relics, sent by William Mercer, a dealer in Cincinnati. After 1887, Boban started also a business with the auction room Levitt and Company. And he had a sales representative for, I quote, judges, lawyers, doctors, members of parliament, professors who want to buy some European antique goods. It's a fascinating traffic of times. While American bourgeoisie tried to revive their European roots, Parisian bourgeoisie bought American Indian goods from dying people. I'd like to it's the list of Indian relics. I'd like to emphasize that Boban's archives underline that these networks mixed private collectors and museums. He sold many exotic prehistoric and ethnographic goods to 10 museums in France, around 200 objects, and to 5 American museums, Metropolitan, American Museum of Natural History, and museums in Providence, Cincinnati, and Baltimore. Several dealers in Paris, London, and New York City organize the exchanges of artifacts between museums. Bauban, for example, organized exchanges between Caen, Guadeloupe, La Guadeloupe, and Philadelphia, New York City, Dresden, and Buenos Aires. They used the prestige of museums to sell artifacts, and in the same time they used the network of amateurs to feed the museums. Last point, I would like to examine the other side of this trade. After 1850, with the increase of tourism, bourgeois became themselves curious hunters. In bourgeoisie mind, out of city started a travel into the past. So a souvenir is necessarily an object from the past. From the end of 50s onwards, traveling gave bourgeois the assurance that they would find authentic goods. A journalist, Roqueplan, wrote in 1867 the erudite tourist with science traveled through farms and villages, going in peasant houses, buying large wardrobes. They consider them as hereditary and treasures, and they bring them to Paris with proudness. New Yorkers left the city to go to Long Island, especially, and the rage for old furniture is for colonial goods and also for prehistoric and archaic objects. In this hunting, the English and the American people played an important role in France, United Kingdom, and Belgium. In May 1907, Harper's Weekly wrote, "The season for the annual influx of Americans into Europe is approaching, and in anticipation of a busy season, the antique dealers are making preparations. All through the winter, the manufacturers of antiques have been kept busy to fill the orders from dealers. Many handbooks for collectors about how to find old curios in France were published, and with a dictionary of patois. While the European and American bourgeois tourism took large expansions thanks to maritime companies and eastern railways, the curious hunting took a new dimension. Bourgeois tried to bring back some authentic souvenir, bought out of the marketplace, pulled up from everyday life, but several dealers opened shops in the touristic places. In Italy, and also in Cairo, Algiers, Japan City, and all of them indicated that they speak English, French or German, and all of them indicated that they sent boxes to Europe and North America. This quest of curios generated a new industry of facts, as you understood, and forgeries allowed to see the naked mechanisms of exoticization processes. Just some examples. Roqueplan, again, wrote, "Goods were made in Paris and then left in provinces in order to take the odor of dilapidation and the seal of history. With little money, peasants took shares of, for Parisian dealers' behalf, selling these imitations." Paul Odell underlined that peasants, I quote, "peasants were essential in this machination because they gave local color and picturesque." We can observe two phenomena. On the one hand, forgers were in Paris and London. They produced, for example, many fakes, and then they sent them in Egypt, where, I quote, "Egyptians scattered and buried them in the sands. Tourists observe Egyptian peasants searching for curios and found them. So they bought them with confidence. We can observe the same phenomenon in Pacific Islands. From 40s, many cut stones, tiki, were produced in Germany and France. The Captain Marsili sent a mail from Tahiti. If I can buy some traditional weapons, it's only thanks to European people that produce and sold them. On the other hand, local craftsmen try to reply to the European and North American demand. For example, de Rochas, an army surgeon, wrote about Neo Caledonia. I quote, stone axes and adzes are produced only for European connoisseurs. And the pastor wrote in 1872, Kanak people started the produce of old weapons in order to reply to the huge demand coming from soldiers, sailors, and state employees who want to bring back some souvenir at home or make a little trade in Paris. Gordon Cumming wrote about Fiji Islands. Natives made tiki statues on cannibal forks and buried them in the ground. Tourists bought them with pleasure. That's the same thing with weapons from Brazil, potteries from Algeria, or tapestries from Turkey. In bourgeoisie mind, primitive men and peasants couldn't produce fake. Hödel wrote that tourists could see Turkish artisans working on fake antique goods behind the Great Bazaar in Istanbul, and just after, they bought this object as authentic goods. The decor and the people were sufficient to make the sense and the value. Consumers, as well as ethnographers and curators, dreamt about a sort of motionless, motionless life of these goods escaped from the time. But this dream changed the production. Moreover, the Western demand colonized imagination. Through the world, craftsmen changed their production in order to model them on Western imagination. Conception is a way, according to Johannes Fabian, to catch the time of others, like my lecture. And at the end, it was a way to conquer the world by trade and imagination. Okay. Thank you for your attention.